World War II was one of the scariest times in human history. Nations all over the world engaged in a frenzied attempt to be one step ahead of their enemies, not just on the battlefield, but in other endeavors as well. Sadly, it seems nothing propels discovery as much as war. It's in times of peril and great need that humans excel the most. Sometimes it's for the good, but sadly, most times it's the other way around. Without a doubt, Nazi inventions left a deep mark on the world we know today. So let's see what the fuss is all about. From one of the sturdiest cars ever manufactured to the sci-fi weapon that could make oceans boil. These are the 10 most incredible inventions by Nazi Germany during war. Number 10. Fanta. Some soda drinks are so popular that you'll find them all over the world, and Coca-Cola is the undisputed king. When I was a kid, the top 3 drinks were Coke, Pepsi, and Fanta. Most of us liked Coke the best, but there were days when you kind of felt orangey. In that case, you grab a nice freshing Fanta to quench your thirst. Little did we know that the drink we were indulging in was invented by the Nazis. Actually, it was Coca-Cola, the Nazis, and World War II that brought about the invention of Fanta. It all started when Coca-Cola was introduced to the German public. In 1933, a man named Max Keith took over Coke's German subsidiary named Coca-Cola GmbH. They say he was a charming and imposing man who was loyal to his company above anything else. So, in order to make it blossom under Nazi rule, he managed to tie the drink to all aspects of German life. Some even said that Hitler himself enjoyed drinking Coke as he watched Gone with the Wind in his private theater. At one point, Keith even made all the workers perform the Nazi salute for Hitler's 50th birthday, commemorating their deepest admiration for the Führer. And it's important to note that Coca-Cola president Robert Woodruff didn't do anything to discourage his European subsidiary from canoodling with the Nazis. As we're shown time and time again, the human quest for profit often outshines ethics and morality, but dark days were ahead. In 1939, the Nazis decided to limit imports and discourage foreign companies. As the war started, most of them couldn't operate at all. That's when Max Keith decided to invent an exclusively German soft drink. From a business perspective, this was ingenious because he would have virtually no competition in the entire German market. The drink was vaguely similar to Coke, caffeinated with an unidentifiable taste. They named it Fanta, and it became an instant sensation. Another brilliant approach was to make it using leftovers from other food industries, so there would be no shortage of supplies. When the Nazis imposed a ban on sugar, Keith used his connections to override the ban. Eventually, housewives would use Fanta to sweeten their soup. To be fair, back then Fanta tasted more like ginger ale than anything else. It wasn't until 1955 that they switched the flavor to the orangey refreshment we know today. In today's Untold Topic, we uncover the powerful secrets of Nazi science and technology. As horrifying as it may sound, some of the world's most crazy inventions happened during times of war, as countries struggled to one-up each other and secure victory. And no country went to greater lengths than Nazi Germany. From the search for ancient artifacts that might give them godly powers, to pushing science to its breaking point in order to create never-before-seen weapons of war, the Nazis tried it all. Presumably, they also worked on flying saucer technology. Some conspiracy theorists believe that the Nazis made working versions of these crafts, but didn't have enough time to hone them to perfection. What propelled these crafts and what was their exact purpose will most likely remain a mystery. Still, these images remain a testament to the exceptional capacity of the German military to strive for innovation and technological development. Comment down below with the hashtag Untold Topic and let us know your opinion in relation to what we just showed on screen. With that said, let's keep things moving. Number 9. The Volkswagen Beetle. When it comes to symbols that mark the 1960s in America, the VW Beetle and the VW Bus are always somewhere on top. In those days of freedom and exploration, most people probably didn't realize that the cars they were driving were not just invented by the Nazis, but were the brainchild of Hitler himself. So how did all this come to be? Well, I'll try to simplify things a bit. After World War I, Germany was humiliated and entered a downward spiral. Inflation quickly turned to hyperinflation as unemployment and hunger soared. This situation gave way to the meteoric rise of Hitler, who promised to make Germany strong again, and the people believed him. To be fair, he did make Germany strong, for a while at least. At that time, cars were considered a luxury. Ordinary people could only dream of owning one. That's when someone, presumably Hitler, got the idea of the people's car. Volkswagen actually means just what it sounds like. Volkswagen, meaning the people's car. Adolf Hitler wanted a car that Germany could produce on a vast scale and relatively cheaply. That way, it would be affordable to the German working class. He hired none other than Ferdinand Porsche to create the design. He told him he wanted an air-cooled family car that could be produced for less than 1,000 Reichsmarks. And pretty soon, the Beetle was born. The reason Hitler wanted it to be air-cooled was because back then, liquid-cooled engines would often freeze during winter. It's crazy to think that the affordable car, which would logically be of poorer quality than standard, was actually regarded for decades as one of the sturdiest and most resilient cars ever built. Still, all the marketing behind the car was just that, marketing. The original car was far above the average German wage. So, Hitler came up with the Spark Cart, also known as the savings card, which enabled the workers to pay off their cars in just under 4 years. Hundreds of thousands opted in and gave their money, which was in turn, sadly, used to finance Hitler's war machine. Number 8. Methadone. The Nazis obviously invented a lot of stuff that's still used today, but did you know they also invented drugs? One of the most notable drugs invented by Germany under Nazi rule was methadone. It was synthesized in 1939 by I.G. Farben, a large pharmaceutical company that was later known for using slave labor from Nazi concentration camps. Methadone's start was slow, and it was said to be likely to cause nausea and overdoses. Some test subjects showed inflammation of the skin, euphoria, signs of toxicity, and the appearance of illness. But profits took precedence again, and even though they concluded that the substance had a high potential to be addictive and to create health problems, it was advertised as having little risk for addiction. After the war, I.G. Farben's developments were confiscated by the U.S. Department of Commerce. Not surprisingly, by 1947, methadone was approved as a painkiller in the U.S. Soon, incidences of people getting addicted to this drug became apparent, and the number of addicts was on a steady rise, even in the UK. At the same time, the number of heroin addicts also grew, and soon, the two drugs crossed paths in an unusual way. Heroin was by far the deadlier drug. From 1950 to 1961, the death toll of people injecting heroin had increased 7-fold, and after a few years, the spread of diseases among heroin users was even worse. So, the researchers from Rockefeller Foundation developed a system for treatment. They would dose heroin addicts with methadone to prevent their use of heroin. Although it was actually just another form of addiction, it prevented the spread of disease and stopped people from committing crimes so they could buy more heroin. The first methadone clinic opened in New York City, but by 1998, there were 79,000 such clinics nationwide. But it wasn't over yet. People started abusing methadone, and the death toll soon reached alarming levels. Just in 2001, the same number of people died of a methadone overdose as between 1990 and 1999. Even those who didn't die suffered from various health risks. The thing is, methadone was never going to cure their addiction because it never addressed the real cause. It was like putting a small band-aid on a gaping wound. Number 7. Night vision. When we think of a modern soldier, we see him wearing top-notch weapons and state-of-the-art equipment, such as communication devices and night vision goggles. And as much as night vision goggles seem futuristic, the fact is that Nazis invented them over half a century ago. The strategy of using nightfall to conquer the enemy has long been used in warfare, but it was always a difficult task because, well, you couldn't see a thing just like your enemies. Torches and flares were early attempts to solve the problem, but they were very limited. In most cases, they illuminated both friend and foe, which defeats the purpose. Then, armies toyed with searchlights, but those became very good targets for enemies to practice shooting. The first infrared night vision device was in fact developed by a Hungarian physicist in 1929. It was an infrared sensitive or night vision television camera intended for use in anti-aircraft defense in the UK. The Germans introduced night vision equipment into the army as early as 1939. By the end of the war, they had around 50 Panther tanks equipped with night optics. But probably the most interesting application of the technology was the so-called ZG-1229, codenamed Vampire. The Vampire was an active infrared device that was mounted on the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle. Even though it was an advanced piece of equipment and those who carried it were called night hunters, which sounds pretty cool, the vampire had its setbacks. First, it was really heavy, with the battery pack alone weighing 13.5 kilograms, and it wasn't really sensitive to body heat like modern night vision stuff. Still, it was some futuristic type of stuff for people back then, and it gave them unprecedented advantage on the battlefield. Luckily for the world, this technology was introduced rather late, in the ending stages of the war. Only 310 vampire scopes were sent to the Eastern Front as late as 1945, and it wasn't enough to shift the tides of war. Number 6. Guided missiles. And speaking of weapons that could have changed the tides of war, but luckily failed to do so, there's the V-2 rocket. This was truly an incredible piece of technology, and whether we like it or not, it enabled humanity to set foot in space and on the moon. That is, if you believe we landed on the moon, but let's not get into that right now. Let's dig into the history of how and why the V-2 rocket was made in the first place. By the time World War II was in full swing, the Allied forces took any chance they got to bomb German cities. This infuriated Hitler, so he decided to get revenge with the ultimate weapon. The Germans had been developing a ballistic rocket since 1936 under the guidance of Wernher von Braun. It was called the Vengeance weapon. Its second incarnation, hence the name V-2, was successfully launched in 1942. 2 years later, it was used to bomb Paris and Great Britain. The rocket could take a payload of about 725 kilograms to a target as far away as 320 kilometers, which was incredible for the time. Luckily, the Germans didn't have enough time to dial in the technology, and the V-2s were never very reliable. But the most exciting part of the history of the V-2s was yet to come. After the war, both the United States and Russia confiscated a large number of these rockets and deconstructed them to learn about the technology. This was the foundation of the space programs in both of those countries. Practical as ever, the Americans took in Wernher von Braun and around 100 of his team members and offered them immunity on the condition that they continued working on the rockets. Even so, the Russians beat them to space. It wasn't until JFK infused an incredible amount of money into the space program that they could beat the Russians at least in going to the moon. Still, if it wasn't for Hitler's lust for vengeance, who knows when or if we would eventually dare to go into space. The V-2 was the first rocket to reach an altitude of 175 kilometers and therefore reach space. It stands as a testament to how war can sometimes speed up technology in ways we never thought possible. Number 5. Methamphetamine. We mentioned that the Germans invented methadone, but there's yet another drug they concocted, and it's still wreaking havoc around the world. Methamphetamine. This highly addictive substance is extremely addictive, and it's especially taken a stronghold on low-income neighborhoods throughout America. Recently, it was immortalized in the hit TV series Breaking Bad. Yet, its history starts in 1938 in Germany, when a drug called Pervitin was launched onto the market by a drug maker called Timler Werk. Soon after that, an army physiologist by the name of Otto Rank realized its true potential. After testing it on some sleep-deprived students, it was introduced to the Army as an alertness aid. There was a warning on the package, though, which said it should only be taken from time to time, whatever that meant. On the outside, amphetamines look like a wonder drug. They're a group of synthetic drugs that stimulate the brain, reduce fatigue and appetite while increasing awareness and a sense of well-being. It later got the nicknames Pep Pill, Go Pill, or most famously, Speed. But when millions of pills flooded the German front lines in World War II, pilots and soldiers started calling it Panzer Schokolade, which translates to the tank chocolate. It was supposed to maintain wakefulness, but for many of those soldiers, the miracle drug turned into a nightmare. They quickly became addicted and started experiencing sweating, dizziness, depression, and even hallucinations. Some died of heart failure, while others shot themselves during psychotic outbursts. Several doctors attempted to limit the use of the drug, but failed in doing so. One strange story came to light recently, and it was based on the letters of a 22-year-old soldier who was given the drug then called Pervitin. He wrote letters home, stating that the drug made him feel alert as if he drank liters of strong coffee. He also said that when he took the drug, all his worries seemed to go away. If only for a few hours, he felt happy. This kind of resembles what most addicts are going through and why they keep craving the drug. The soldier begged his family to try and find more purvatan for his supplies. He later expressed that exhausted by the war, he became cold and apathetic and completely without interest. His name was Heinrich Boll, and he later became one of Germany's best-known post-war writers. And in 1972, Boll won the Nobel Prize for Literature. The use of meth persisted throughout Germany and was finally banned in 1988. By that time, Pandora's box was open wide, and illegal production started worldwide. Number 4. Programmable computers. I remember learning about the early computers in school, but no one ever mentioned Konrad Zuse. So imagine my surprise when I found out that it was this German guy who built the world's first programmable computer in his parents' home just before World War II. The so-called Z1 was a mechanical computer, and it wasn't very good or reliable. To make it even worse, it was destroyed when the Allies bombed Berlin in 1943. Originally, the machine was called V1, short for Experimental Model 1 in German, but V1 was also the name of the flying bombs being developed at the time. So after the war, it was renamed to Z1. What's remarkable is that Z1 had all the parts of a modern computer: control unit, memory, microsequences, floating point logic, and input-output devices. Now, before you start geeking out on me, you must realize that this was a massive contraption. It had some 20,000 parts and weighed close to a ton. Imagine building such a monster in your parents' basement. It's crazy. Okay, he didn't build it in the basement, but the living room, which is an even more remarkable feat. Zuse was so confident he could build this thing that he quit his job in airplane construction and got money from his parents, his sister, some of his fellow students, and Kurt Pahnke, who produced calculating machines in Berlin. He relied on using makeshift parts such as thin metal strips, metal cylinders, glass plates, and telephone relays. Because no commercial relays were available, the only electrical unit was a small electric motor that gave the clock a frequency of 1 Hz. The Z1 was followed by Z2 and Z3, but the war abruptly ended the work on Z4. However, in the 1950s, Zuse's company produced calculating machines and sold them all over Germany. He later rebuilt his Z1 model in the 1980s. It's now displayed in the German Museum of Technology in Berlin, and Zuse is widely recognized as a pioneer of computer technology. So, next time you look at your computer, or even a phone, know that you owe it all to a Nazi. Just kidding. I have no idea if Zuse was a real Nazi or just a regular German. Number 3. The jerry can. With computers and Enigma machines, mind-altering war drugs, and sophisticated weaponry taking the limelight, there's one unsung hero of World War II who often goes unnoticed in the history books: the jerry can. I know it sounds ludicrous, but just hear me out on this one. Before World War II, fuel containers were really poorly designed and flimsy. The British Army relied on 2 types of small fuel containers that were different only in size. I mean, look at this picture. This thing was so poorly constructed and prone to breaking. And as if that wasn't enough, some people estimated that if you carried them over rough terrain, sometimes you lost as much as a quarter of the fuel. Their nickname was the Flimsies. If this was a Monty Python sketch, it would be funny. But considering all the fire hazards they produced, it's mind-boggling that no one came up with a better design sooner. Well, perhaps they realized that when it comes to design, they better just leave it to the Germans. So they did. The container that later became known as the jerry can was first introduced in 1937 by Vincent Grunvogel, and it looks rather simple. But when you take a closer look, you realize how ingenious it really was. First of all, it had indentations on the sides, which made it far sturdier and allowed it more room to shrink and expand at different temperatures. It's a common practice today, but back then it was a novel idea. Another ingenious element was the handles. Prior cans had handles that were welded on, and after some rough use, they would often snap, but the jerry can was stamped from 2 halves which were then welded in the middle. The handle was thus a part of the can and couldn't break off. But I always wondered why in the hell they would put 3 handles on a gas canister. Well, if the cans were empty, the soldier could take 2 in each hand and carry 4 at once. Once he filled them up, he could use the middle one for balance and carry 2 full cans back. Or, if there were 2 of them, they could grab the outside handles and carry it together. Also, the handles were above the filling cap, so they always contained water. This meant that the can would float if dropped in water. First, the Americans copied the design when they came up with it by accident, and after the 1940s, the British copied it too. Eventually, everyone was using the jerry can. Number 2. Nerve agents. As genius as they sometimes were, many German inventions were misused during the war. A great example of that was the nerve toxins invented by Dr. Gerhard Schrader. Schrader was a German chemist working for the aforementioned IG Farben Company. He specialized in the discovery of insecticides and hoped to one day get rid of world hunger. It's perhaps ironic that even though he might have had noble intentions, he would accidentally discover nerve agents. Sometimes he's referred to as the father of nerve agents, which is a title I don't think he appreciates that much. In 1936, he synthesized traben, and later on, sarin, soman, and cyclosarin, which were all highly toxic gases. These were called organophosphates, and 70% of today's pesticides fall into this group. When it comes to humans, these toxins basically stop cells from communicating with each other, which is obviously a very bad and potentially fatal thing. It's especially harming to the developing nervous systems of children. It was later learned that the Nazis stockpiled these gases, especially traben, but luckily never used them in warfare. And we have to thank an unlikely circumstance for that. You see, Hitler had fought in World War I. At that time, the use of harmful gases in warfare was rampant on all sides. Countless soldiers died in agony, gasping for air that was never to come. Hitler himself had experienced the horrors of gas warfare and vowed to never use it. I imagine that if it were used as a tactic in World War II, the death toll would have been much, much greater. Number 1. The Sun Gun. We often think of Star Wars as the franchise that brought sci-fi to mass adoption by moviegoers across the world. But the truth is that futuristic weapons such as the Death Star were planned decades before that. I'm not sure if George Lucas knew about the Nazi Sun Gun when he wrote Star Wars. So if any of you know, please enlighten me in the comments below. Anyhow, Hitler had concocted a plan to build a satellite that he could use to attack his enemies from Earth's orbit. And as preposterous as it may sound, the plan actually had some solid physics behind it. The so-called Sonnengewehr, or the Sun Gun, would have been a mile-wide satellite armed with a giant mirror. Nazis envisioned it could potentially burn entire cities to ash, or even boil a part of the ocean. Have you ever burned ants with a magnifying glass as a kid? Well, it's the same thing, just much, much larger. By the way, if you still enjoy burning ants, I suggest you talk to someone about it. Anyhow, the mirror was supposed to focus separate light waves, adding them up. This generates a whole lot of heat energy, and even though science backs it up, luckily, there was no way that the Nazis could have pulled it off. In the 1940s, there were no rockets yet that could take all the parts in orbit, and there was no way to assemble them in orbit either. So again, these plans were a little ahead of their time. Even if they somehow managed to achieve this, experts believe that much of the energy would have dissipated as it traveled 1,000 kilometers from Earth's orbit to the surface. On the other hand, if they placed it in a lower orbit, the surface of the Earth would have been rotating at a faster pace, making it more difficult to hit the targets way below. So once again, we were kind of lucky, managing to dodge another bullet from the Nazis. If any of these crazy Nazi plans worked, the Earth would have been a much different place today. Thank you for hanging out with me once again. And if you want to watch more crazy top 10s like this, please hit that subscribe button and tell me what you want to see next in the comments below. We'll see you next time.